welcome back to Babies on Backorder. Last week, we learned about IVF in the United States, and this week, I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Lynn Morgan about Costa Rican healthcare and their reproductive politics. This interview was originally conducted on October 30th via Zoom. This allowed me to speak to Dr. Morgan from Flagstaff while she was in Massachusetts. First, I would like to give you all a background on Costa Rican healthcare. Costa Rica has had a reputation as a stable democracy and a champion of inter-American human rights law for many years. This is why it came as a surprise when the Costa Rican Constitutional Court banned in vitro fertilization in 2000. To this day, Costa Rica remains to be the only country in the world to have completely banned IVF after it had been successfully conducted. In 2012, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled that reproductive rights are human rights and that women's rights take precedence over embryo rights. However, it was a difficult process to get IVF back into Costa Rica after this ruling. The first IVF baby to be born after the ban was in 2017. Prior to recording this episode, I did read 2 of her publications. I highly recommend reading these publications as well as others by Dr. Morgan, as they are highly informative. They will also help you understand this podcast episode just a little bit more. The first publication I read is Human Life is Inviolable, Costa Rica's Human Rights Crucible, which discusses how a country that supports universal health care could be labeled a human rights violator as a result of its efforts to protect nascent human life. The second publication I read is Costa Rica's Oversized Role in Latin American Sexual and Reproductive Rights Lawfare. This publication discusses Costa Rica's key role in Latin American sexual and reproductive rights lawfare, as well as the resulting backlash. Thanks for listening to me talk for a little bit, and I really hope you enjoy this episode.
Yeah, my name is Lynn Morgan. I'm a professor emeritus of anthropology at Mount Holyoke College, and I retired 4 years ago. I did my dissertation researching Costa Rica in the 1980s and have always been interested in Costa Rican healthcare in particular. Somewhere around 2010 or so, I started getting interested in reproductive politics in Costa Rica, and that was because I had heard that Costa Rica had banned in vitro fertilization. And I was really surprised about that when I heard it, because I knew that Costa Rica was a country that had a very good health system. Costa Ricans love their families and they love kids and have always taken advantage of medical advances in the country. And so I was kind of surprised that Costa Rica moved to ban IVF. And so that sparked my curiosity, and I decided to investigate that a little bit more and try and see if I could figure out what was going on there and why that made sense for them to do. So that's kind of how I got started in the project.
Awesome. I know I just finished a couple days ago reading some of the papers you sent me, and you mentioned this topic of sexual versus reproductive rights and how typically conservatives kind of mesh the two together. On the far right, and so I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the differences you see between sexual and reproductive rights and maybe why they should be separated more in politics.
Yeah, I actually might come out in a different place on that, which is that I know that in the United States where I live, people talk about sexual rights movements or the rights of sexual minorities and reproductive rights as basically like 2 different constituencies. But one of the things I've learned from reading a lot of theory in Latin America, looking at the theorists who are writing about these issues in Spanish, is that the issues are really very much related to one another. They have to do with who gets to have power and control over our bodies and what we do with our bodies and our sexuality and our reproduction. And so in a sense, those things are related to each other. And I noticed that when I was doing research in Argentina about abortion rights, and it was around the time that Argentina had legalized same-sex marriage. They became the first country in the Americas to legalize same-sex marriage, and they legalized same-sex marriage before they had legalized abortion, and that was rare. Most of the countries have legalized abortion first, and then later they legalized same-sex marriage. But in Argentina, it went the other way around. And so going to some of the demonstrations in Buenos Aires just to see what was going on there, I noticed that there were a lot of people from the same-sex marriage movement that were speaking at the abortion rights movements and vice versa. And so I started realizing, like, they're allies, they really see each other as supporting the same kind of fight. And the fight is to be able to control our own bodies and do what we want between consenting adults, and also to have the number of children that we want, or not to have children at all, and that those decisions should be up to us as individuals, and we should be supporting one another in those movements. So I was really curious about why in the United States we separated those movements, and I think there are historical reasons why that happened, but I think that there's a lot of sort of natural allyship, and that it would make sense for us to work together, because if we can have larger, more powerful coalitions, then I think that'll help the political movements on what we see as both sides. So I'd argue that we should have more to do. We should be doing more to support each other and to create alliances between reproductive and sexual rights movements.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that when you were in Costa Rica, even though they had banned IVF at the time, you saw the sort of allyship between all of these different groups, whether it was on IVF or abortion or same-sex marriage, or was it a little bit more separated?
Yeah, in Costa Rica, the situation was really different than it was in Argentina. Argentina has a very different history. They had spent a long time under a military dictatorship. They considered themselves really behind on human rights measures because they just literally weren't allowed to organize under the dictatorship. Costa Rica had a very different history. They didn't have a military dictatorship. These movements, both the feminist reproductive rights movement and the sexual rights movements in Costa Rica, were very, very small and very loosely organized. And so there wasn't a lot of mobilizing around it at all. Mm-hmm. The Costa Rican feminists were really more concerned with making sure that poor women had access to healthcare and had access to contraception and stuff like that. They weren't thinking about IVF. And I think I pointed out in one of my articles that when the Constitutional Court in Costa Rica banned in vitro fertilization, it came as a surprise to a lot of feminists who didn't even know that it was happening. So there was no sort of public conversation about it before this decision was taken, and there wasn't any mobilizing around it. There weren't any social movements developed around IVF at that time. So that's one of the reasons why it came as a surprise. And some of the feminists were, they were like, "Whoa, what's going on here? Like, is this something we should be concerned about?" And some of them weren't concerned about it because they thought that IVF was a rich women's issue, that it wasn't something that was going to affect the majority of people in Costa Rica, just a few families maybe that were suffering from infertility or that needed to have access to IVF. And they really didn't see it as a feminist issue, at least not initially. But I think once they started thinking about it and talking about it and realizing how the implications that it was going to have, then they started to realize, yes, this really is a feminist reproductive rights issue and we need to be concerned about it.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that was a surprise to me in your article, because especially in the United States, I think that the feminists have moved towards protecting IVF, at least with the recent kind of murmurings that have been going around. Do you think, I know in the article you mentioned Anna as a pseudonym for one of the women who was told that she's overly emotional, doesn't know how to regulate her emotions when she was looking to get an abortion. Do you think that stories like that helped ignite the feminist movement in Costa Rica, or do you think it was more just the wage gap and increasing like class gap between poor people and richer people? Like, what do you think really ignited them? Was it just thinking about the process, or was it actual stories from women who are experiencing issues?
I think it's stories. I think stories are always really powerful. But I think that it was also some of the transnational organizing that was happening, because the Latin American feminists have been organized for a long time, and they meet with each other and they talk to each other and they support each other in their fights. So it was not just seeing what was going on in Costa Rica, it was the Costa Rican feminists being in conversation really with feminists in other countries and seeing what was happening around the organization of reproductive rights in other countries in the Americas. So I think that had a lot to do with it. As far as mobilizing the public within Costa Rica, I think the IVF issue did become more and more salient over time. In 2000, when it was first banned, not very many people were paying attention to it, as I've said, but over time, as the case got brought before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and then eventually to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, people really started paying more attention to it. Political candidates were using it as a part of their platform to run for office. And so people were paying more attention, and it was being more publicly debated than it had been in the beginning. So I think it was a combination of all of those things, but we can't forget the transnational piece, the international piece. And that's one of the things that I think, as somebody who lives in the United States, we're often pretty insular, pretty parochial, just in how we think about these debates. We think about them as kind of restricted to the United States, and we don't always think about what implications they might have in other countries. So that's something that I've been very attuned to working in Latin America, is the extent to which the activists on all sides are really connected with one another. So they have a lot of conversations, and more all the time when we have technologies like Zoom and conferencing technologies that allow us to be in more regular touch with each other, then that creates the ability to do more active organizing on an ongoing basis.
Exactly. I think it's nice that we have, as much as, technology enables bad information to spread quickly, I think it's nice that we have the technology to, sort of explain things and get things to people that might not have heard about it. I was really surprised to hear IVF framed as a commercial enterprise that traffics in human lives. I guess I had never thought of it as something that could be, sold and commercialized. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that argument and why I think it seemed to really appeal to certain people of we should be protecting these embryos and it shouldn't be something that should be on the black market, just because with my personal views, I don't necessarily look into that side of things. And so if you have any wisdom on it, I would really enjoy it.
Well, I do think it's one of the things that activists on both sides of this issue have been concerned about, which is the commercialization and regulation of these things. On the feminist side, certainly feminist women's health activists have really wanted to make sure that women's health was being protected, and so that when egg retrieval was being done, that it was being done in a way that was responsible, and that the companies or the doctors that were involved in it would be held accountable. There's very little regulation of the IVF industry in the United States, and that's something that feminist activists have been concerned about. On the conservative side, conservative anti-abortion activists have argued that life should not be commodified in that way, and that just the same way that they argue that abortion doctors are making money off of performing abortions, they would argue that IVF clinics are making money out of egg retrieval and in vitro fertilization itself, and then the process of implanting the embryos. And they consider that a violation of God's will, and consider that really as something that ought to be resisted and ought to be controlled. So I think that on both sides, there's concern about the commodification of life and the consequences of that for both for women's bodies and women's health, but also for the embryos.
Mm-hmm. Has there been any legislation that's been, introduced or passed in any countries that you know of that protects the commodification of women's lives and, embryos? Or has that sort of been kind of pushed to the side?
I'm not an expert on that, so I can't give you a full answer to your question, but I can say that very few countries have no regulation at all over the process of in vitro fertilization. So a lot of countries regulate it more heavily than it's regulated in the United States. And that is for all those reasons, to make sure that if there are any adverse effects or anything, that we can know about those, that we can collect information about those, that we can be aware of those risks, so that people can be informed when they're going into a procedure like this. But I'm not an expert on how the laws compare across different countries.
Recently in our bioethics class, we were actually talking about the process of experimenting on embryos, and when was the right time or the wrong time to stop, especially with CRISPR and new technologies like that. And in the United States, I know that if, IVF happens and two embryos are implanted, those other embryos are either frozen or deemed medical waste. Do you know what that process is like in other countries or Costa Rica? Do they have to implant all of the embryos?
No, they don't have to implant all the embryos. In fact, there are groups, I forget what it's called, but you can look up the Association of Reproductive Medicine or something. It's a professional group of doctors and clinicians who work in this area, and they set their own guidelines for themselves and for their colleagues to follow. So they recommend, I'm not sure what it is right now, but they recommend a very limited number of embryos being implanted at any one time. And that's really important, because when more embryos are implanted, you increase the risk of having multiple births. And that risk brings a lot of concerns about the woman's health. So there's been an effort to try and reduce the number of embryos that are implanted at any one time, and that will reduce then the health risks associated with it. At some point, I saw a table that showed the number of multiple births that was happening in Costa Rica over time, and it went way up. And it went way up when IVF was restricted, because women would go to other countries to get IVF, and they would have an incentive to implant as many embryos as possible, because they didn't want to have to go back again and again. Okay. And so the number of multiples went way up, and you got, twins, triplets, quadruplets, quintuplets being born, and that was really not in anybody's interest. Mm-hmm. So they've now created better legislation around that to try and reduce that, but that's something that a lot of people have been concerned about all over the world.
That's an interesting bounce back of, even though they banned IVF, you were having this sort of inverse effect in the country with births. Right. Do you think that once IVF was re-established in Costa Rica, I know, and I think one of your articles, it said the first baby born from IVF was born in 2020 after everything passed. Do you think that because Costa Rica has this history of a good healthcare system, and I know in the United States we have issues where IVF is super expensive, and it's typically like a luxury for a lot of people to be able to afford it. Do you think that that is less of a problem in Costa Rica because of this nationalized healthcare system, or do you think they still have problems with it?
I don't know from my own research experience the answer to that question, because that isn't something that I have researched, but it's true, as you say, that Costa Rica has a nationalized health system, and the implementation of in vitro fertilization in Costa Rica does require that it be paid for by the nationalized health system, what's called the Caja Costarricense de Seguro Social. And so they do cover it. Women and families need to meet particular criteria in order to have it covered. And there is concern, as there is with the proliferation of any kind of expensive medical procedure, that it's going to take up an increasingly large percentage of the available budget, and that people won't be able to afford other kinds of issues because you just can't pay for everything. So there is concern about that in Costa Rica, but I think that it has made it much more accessible. It's made IVF and other kinds of assisted reproductive technologies much more accessible than they would otherwise be to just regular people. And that, you could say, is a good thing. Like, that's something that we don't have in the United States, because in the United States, it's not required for insurance companies to cover IVF. And I've talked to friends who felt like they couldn't leave a particular job because they had coverage for services that they thought they might need or had needed in the past. and that lock them into a particular kind of job or position. So it creates a lot of inequities in the United States, the way that it's financed here, that don't exist in Costa Rica, at least not to the same extent.
Mm-hmm. I know that a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community use IVF as a form of ways to conceive a child, and that is an outcry in the United States as IVF is coming under question. I know same-sex marriage was legalized in Costa Rica as well. Is do you think that the same level of care towards IVF from those people in that community happens in Costa Rica as it's sort of happening in the United States?
Yeah, because it's relatively recent, I haven't really kept up with that, so I don't know what's happening with that. I think a lot of gay men use surrogates. I don't think surrogacy is legal in Costa Rica, so they would have to use international surrogates, and that's been a whole other issue. Speaking of issues that are and are not related to each other, of course it's related, but it's not something that I've done any research on, so I don't know.
That's something I can always,
Sure.
look up and research as well. I was just curious. Kind of coming towards, and you can tell me if you're uncomfortable with talking about it because I know your research isn't super recent. But I kind of wanted to talk to you about the United States a little bit, especially because IVF is something that's been questioned recently, especially after overturning Roe v. Wade. I wanted to just, and this is personal, so you don't have to answer. Do you remember where you were when Roe v. Wade got overturned?
Yes, I do. It was my wedding anniversary, and I was in Iceland. So I had
the Northern Lights.
No, it was in June, and so it wasn't in the sun hardly ever sets in Iceland in June. It's very long days, and so it's not a good time of year to see the Northern Lights. But we had gone on a long hike that day, and I came back to the house where I had Wi-Fi, and my phone started blowing up, and so then I knew, and that's when I found out about it. But I hadn't. It wasn't a surprise to me. I had expected that this was going to happen, and a lot of the lawyers who had been following what was happening on the Supreme Court expected that this was going to happen, so it didn't come as a shock to me. We knew that this was going to happen. It's interesting really to think about the relationship between what happened in Costa Rica with the banning of IVF and what happened in the United States with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because I think that what's happened has been this group of this kind of coalition of anti-abortion activists who saw an opening in Costa Rica to ban in vitro fertilization. They saw an opening because of the composition of the Constitutional Court. They knew that some of the members of the Constitutional Court might be inclined to support an argument that said that IVF should be banned because of the damage or possibility for destroying embryos that it creates, that the procedure creates. And so they took advantage of that timing in order to bring a case very quickly before the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court agreed. So then IVF was banned. I think a similar thing happened in the United States. I think that there was, a process of anti-abortion activists mobilizing over a long period of time to get the judges the composition of the Supreme Court that they wanted. And then when they got that, they took advantage of that to push through this case that ended up overturning Roe v. Wade, nearly 50 years of having a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. So it points us to kind of looking at these strategies, that the activists are using over time, and thinking about how those strategies are the same or different in different kinds of places. So what happened in Costa Rica, I think, ended up many years later. The banning happened in the year 2000. The decision by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to overturn that ban happened in 2012, way late in the year, in 2012. And it wasn't until 2020 that the first IVF baby was born in Costa Rica. So it was a full 20 years without IVF, or if people wanted IVF, they had to go out of the country in order to get it. And that obviously restricted it to people who had the means to do that. But It ended up backfiring for Costa Rica because the Inter-American Court came out with a ruling that really said that embryos are not persons, they're not legal persons, they don't have the rights of legal persons, that personhood actually accrues slowly over time, and that women's rights should be respected above the rights of embryos. It was a really consequential decision in many, many ways. Mm-hmm. And so you might ask yourself, why has that decision not had an impact on the United States? Why didn't that affect the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade? And that's because the United States has never ratified the American Convention on Human Rights, and the United States doesn't consider itself bound by the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So you have 23 countries of the Americas that have agreed that they are going to abide by decisions of the Inter-American Court. The US does not. And so, a decision that has been taken in the United States never could be taken now in the countries of the Americas because they're bound by a different ruling. And so what you've seen is in the Americas, countries have been liberalizing their abortion rights over time, partly in response to the decision by the Inter-American Court. So Mexico has legalized abortion, Colombia has legalized abortion, Argentina has legalized abortion, and Uruguay did it before that. And so you really have like this massive movement towards greater reproductive rights in Latin America, and the United States is now the outlier.
Yeah, as I was going through your articles, I even called my mom because I was frustrated and even like a little bit upset reading about 2016, 2018, and the Congress people and people in legislation in the United States that were almost disagreeing with the Court on Human Rights and saying that it should be up to the sovereignty of each country, similar to how abortion rights should be up to the states in those people's views, which, is frustrating as a woman. And I was wondering what you think about whether or not the United States could get back. I know it took 20 years for IVF to come back in Costa Rica. And do you think that the United States can come back from the point we're at currently with abortion?
Yeah, I do. And I am reminded that when I listen to the lawyers talk about this, I sit in on a lot of webinars where lawyers are talking about the long term of this issue. And they say, look, yes, it's true that the composition of the Supreme Court that we have right now is not conducive to reinstating Roe v. Wade. But number one, there is the potential of Congress to pass a law that would do that. And number two, this court won't exist forever. And it may take a long time, but there are going to be changes in the court over time. And that we need to keep that long view in mind. I know it's frustrating for those of us who, we only have like, how many years are you going to work? How long is your lifetime? And what is it going to mean for my daughter, my granddaughter, your granddaughter, assuming you might ever have one. But it is going to change. It is going to change over time. And I think that in general, the movement has been towards recognizing greater reproductive freedom and towards recognizing the need for reproductive justice kind of across the board. And so I think those things are going to make a difference over time. We're already seeing that in the United States. Every time that abortion has been on the ballot in the United States, even in what they call red states like Kansas, it's won. And so clearly public opinion is not with the Supreme Court Dobbs decision right now. Public opinion is this decision in some ways has backfired too, because it's made people realize that they need to be concerned about an issue that they might not have been paying too much attention to before.
Yeah, I know when we first started brainstorming this project, the IVF case was going through Georgia, I believe it was.
Alabama, I think.
Alabama, yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm so bad with the East Coast states. But it honestly came as it was a relief to me when people showed up and, decided that IVF should be allowed in the United States, especially with how much the super extreme Catholic side and evangelicals have been sort of coming together to promote pro-life and anti-abortion and maybe even anti-IVF. And it was interesting to me because in our class, when we talked about IVF and things like abortion, we were pretty cohesive, and we have, kids from all sorts of sides of the spectrum. And so it surprises me that a group that's, almost really enforcing and asking their followers to believe those same things has had so much success in other countries, especially Costa Rica is a great example of that. Why do you think it failed, that like movement sort of failed in the United States and didn't fail in Costa Rica? Do you think it was timing? Do you think people are more educated on IVF? What, what was
No, I don't think it was timing necessarily. I think it was just kind of serendipitous. I think it had to do with the circumstances of the court and how the case was brought in Costa Rica, and it was brought sort of very quietly, quickly, under the radar. I don't think that Costa Ricans in general supported that decision. I'm not sure if there have been public opinion polls, probably there have, but I don't know the results of those polls looking at support for in vitro fertilization. But there was a documentary film that was made about that decision. It's called Beautiful Sin, A Beautiful Sin, by Gabriela Quiros. And it's a really beautiful film. And she interviews a number of people who say, well, if the church is opposed to in vitro fertilization, if the Catholic Church is opposed to it, they say it's a sin that you shouldn't take God's will into your own hands that way to create life. Life is a gift from God. It shouldn't be something that people are seeking to create for themselves. And they said, yes, maybe it's a sin, but it's a beautiful sin because it creates families, and it allows people to have families that wouldn't otherwise be able to have them for various reasons. And so I found that throughout Latin America, that even people who were considered themselves very Catholic would support in vitro fertilization because they thought it was a good thing. It was a good thing to have families. Doesn't God want us to have families? And so they made peace with that. They didn't really see a contradiction in their Catholicism or their devotion to their faith and their support for in vitro fertilization. So that's one of the things that's really interesting, is how people come to terms with moral decisions for themselves that may be at odds with those of their religious leaders. Mm-hmm. But the religious leaders they're not always in touch with what's going on with their parishioners. They don't always know how people feel about these things. So it's very interesting to look at that. And I found that over and over again, that people in Latin America, even in very Catholic countries, in Chile, talking to people who they love IVF. They use a lot of IVF in Chile. And yet, it's a very, very Catholic country, very conservative country in many ways.
I think a lot of people, especially I hear from even younger people, question how you can be pro-family with being, pro-abortion and pro-IVF. And I think that's a question like I've had to come to terms with. I'm pro-family 100%, but I also think that it should be a woman's choice. So if you had any words or messages on how you can sort of come to terms with that, or how college students or people who are just now getting into their education and learning about these things, how they can do that as well.
Yeah. I think really what I would say is that it's important to look into the complexities of these issues, because what does it mean when somebody says they're pro-family? And just to think about the many ways that you could interpret that phrase or that slogan, and to think about, do we agree that love makes a family? Do we agree that people should be able to love who they want and have families of their own choosing? Or do we think that there should be some definition of a family that's imposed by someone else, by a religious ideology that has like one man and one woman? I mean, that wasn't even true in the Bible. In the Bible, there was a lot of polygamy and other kinds of relationships that exist in the Bible. So you can't even really say that that's a biblical idea. And so what does it mean? Does it mean that you want to have some rigid definition of family, mother, father, and children, no matter what happens, what if there's abuse within the family? What if it's a dysfunctional family? What if the kids don't have enough to provide for them, for the family doesn't have enough to provide for their kids or to raise their kids? Should they deserve some kind of support? I mean, I think about it as like, we're all in this together. We help each other out and we support each other, and we should be, I think, compassionate and understanding of each other's choices around those kinds of things. It's not always easy to kind of follow the dogma on these things. That's not the way life works.
Exactly. And then lastly, what advice would you give to young college students who are trying to navigate this sort of highly polarizing subject like abortion, IVF, reproductive, and sexual rights? I think right now it's hard to find the truth in the middle ground and come together. And so what would your advice be?
I'm a very strong believer in reproductive rights. I'm a very strong believer in the idea that people should have the ability and be trusted to make their own decisions about what's right for them and their bodies and their futures. And I think just having a little bit more understanding and a little bit more compassion for people is something that is in short supply these days. I do think that some of the stories that we've been hearing about in the news about the very difficult circumstances that people face should influence us and make us think twice about whether we have all the answers about these things. So, I mean, one of the things that I've learned over time is to have more humility about other people's circumstances, and to recognize that unless I've walked in their shoes, I can't really understand their reality. And so, I do respect the right and the ability of people to make their own decisions and to come to decisions that are different than the ones that I've come to about these issues. I really respect that kind of ideological diversity. But I also am very skeptical about people imposing that on others that they don't know in particular. So that's what I would say, is just to try and listen. My advice would be to try and really listen and have some compassion and have some humility as we think about formulating our own opinions about what are these really divisive issues. And it's okay not to know. It's okay to take some time and make up your mind. I know we're in a situation, we live in a kind of world that encourages us to be polarized and to make up our minds about things too early. But I'd say if we can just take our time and be open-minded about these things, that'll serve us all well in the long run.
That's great advice. I took that advice. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me and having, this Zoom call. My plan for the podcast is to introduce some of your writing a little bit more, just so that people understand what's going on and can, fit into our conversation a little bit better. So once I sort of get that all together and ready to be published, I'll send it to you, at least the audio manuscript, so that you can
Wonderful.
do it before anything's published. If you have any questions, concerns, things like that. But yeah, I appreciate it. My group appreciates it. I'm excited to share your comments with my class.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic and in my work. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank
and your
you.
Classmates also. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Lynn Morgan and learned at least a little bit more about IVF. I encourage you all to reflect on some of the main topics we discussed in this episode, including the differences between sexual and reproductive rights, as well as the importance of having an open mind and doing your best to support the people around you. I know we discuss some controversial topics like religion and politics and reproductive rights. So take some time to process everything and feel free to listen to this podcast again to reaffirm your understanding. I want to thank Dr. Morgan once again for taking the time out of her day to help me with this podcast and shed some light on IVF policy in Costa Rica. And lastly, remember to have compassion for one another and be